I'm in Visual Studio 2017 on my Windows computer. I'm going to go to the File menu and choose New Project. And we're going to create our first Xamarin project just to check and make sure that all of our emulators are working and that things are running smoothly. So I'm going to come to Visual C#, come down to Cross-Platform. We want a Mobile Apps Xamarin form. And I'm just going to call this Xamarin Workflow Demo. And then I'm going to choose a location. Now here's one word of caution. Keep your location path fairly short. So I'm going to put this in my data folder. I have a folder set up for Xam projects. I'm just going to select the folder. If you have the location too long and with the embedded folders and so forth, you can get a path that's more than 256 characters that causes issues in compiling. I'm going to click OK. There are 3 different templates we can use. We'll look at these down the road. For now, we're just going to choose blank. I can choose which platforms I want to develop for. I'm going to choose all 3, Android, iOS, and Universal Windows. And for code sharing, we're going to use .NET Standard. I'm going to click OK. And it's going to build the project. It's actually building 4 projects. One is our shared code. One is our Android project, our iOS project, and our Universal Windows project. And we can see those 4 projects over here in the Solution Explorer. I'm just going to roll these up so you can more easily see there are 4 there. The first one is our shared code. This is just the name of our project. If we expand that, there's a file here called app.xaml. This file basically contains information on which XAML page to use to start off your project, because we can't have multiple XAML pages. By default, we're going to use the main page.xaml, but you can rename that. You can also add in other pages and choose those as your startup. There's also information in the app.xaml in terms of backgrounding, what to do when you restart your program, things like that. We'll look at that much later in the course. For now, we have this main page.xaml. That's where we're going to create our interface, and that's what we see over here. This is our interface. Unlike Windows Forms, where we can drag and drop and change properties, we're going to develop our interface using code. And it's using the code language is called XAML. It's Extensible Application Markup Language developed by Microsoft. Underneath that is a code behind of C#, so it's main page.xaml.cs. That's where we'll write our C# code. Then we have projects for Android, iOS, and Universal Windows. Each of these contains some folders such as assets and resources that when we add in images, we're going to add images to each of these different projects because the resolutions have to be set for that platform, as well as different file naming conventions. For now, we're going to basically do all of our work in the shared code. I want you to notice one other thing here, and that is of these 3 projects, one of them is bold, and that is considered our startup project. If we were to go and test this right now, up here at the top, we would see we're testing the Android project, and we can choose an emulator to test it on, or we could test it on a physical device. If I wanted to test the iOS app, I could right-click on it and choose Set as Startup Project, and now, if I were to test, it's going to test on an iPhone emulator. And same with the Windows. I can right-click here, choose Set as Startup Project, and that's going to test for Windows. It can either use the local machine or I can specify I want to use the simulator, which will simulate a Surface Pro tablet. All right, I'm going to go back and make Android my startup project. I've noticed there's a bit of a bug in the most recent versions of Xamarin in that it's not providing a reference to our source code in the other 3 projects. We need that. I'm going to right-click on the Android solution and choose Add Reference. I just want to verify that there's a check mark for the project for that one. Now in this case, Xamarin did include those references for me, but I've had some another version have problems with that. So I always want to check that. You might get an error saying it couldn't find the app when it tries to compile. This is usually the solution for that. Just make sure you have a reference in Android, iOS, and UWP to your shared code project. I'm going to go ahead and click cancel. There is also a previewer in our solution, and I can click here and see the preview. Now, what you want to do is build your project first in order for that preview to work. I can go back to the source code here. I can also drag this out and see both at the same time. And if you have a large monitor, that's probably the way to work, is to have your code and your previewer. So it says I need to build in order to use the preview. I'm going to go to the Build menu and just choose Build Solution. And down at the bottom, you can see the green progress bar here, some icons representing some processes. And usually over here on the far left, you'll see some messages pop up as it's building or as you're trying to deploy to a device or to the emulator. So you always want to kind of watch this bottom down here on the PC side of Visual Studio. And as we saw earlier on the Mac side, it's up towards the top. So now that's finished building, I can see my interface from the XAML code being displayed in the Android previewer. And Android by default has a dark background, and on the iOS side we have a light background with dark text. Of course, we can change the colors in our XAML code. But now the preview is working. One other thing I'd like you to check when you're creating projects is the NuGet packages. NuGet packages are blocks of code with dynamic link libraries that we can include in our projects that do things. And so there's a NuGet package for Xamarin.Forms that's included, but it may be outdated. So what I'm going to do is come to my solution here. I'm going to right click on it and choose Manage NuGet Package for Solution. And this will manage the NuGet package for all 4 of our projects. The one I'm really concerned about is the Xamarin.Forms. I'm going to click on that, and I see that right now I have 3.4.0 point something version installed, but the most recent version is 3.6.0. I'm going to click my project checkbox, which checks all of the 4 projects, and I'm going to click the install button. If the most recent version is installed, the install button will be grayed out. So I'm going to click install and click OK, and that I accept the license. The other one is the Universal Windows Platform, which only affects our UWP project. But the same thing, I'm going to select that. And I can see right now I have 6.1.5, the most recent version is 6.1.9. So I'm going to put that just into the UWP project. Let's try that. So I'm going to say OK. Okay, we're done with that one. I'm not going to worry about any of these others. As we get into some more advanced projects, you might be concerned about updating the .NET Standard Library. I'm going to leave that as is in this project. I'm going to close my NuGet Package Manager. And let's do one more thing here in our XAML code. We have welcome to Xamarin.Forms as our label text. I'm just going to change that to add in at SMCC. And you notice when we do that, it puts it in the label here. It's displaying that in our preview. Same thing over in Android, we see it there. So that's how we can see immediately as we make changes in our XAML code to see it reflected in the previewer. Typically, if it doesn't get reflected in the previewer, there's something wrong with our code. Android is our startup project. So I have up here, I can debug, and I've got an emulator here of Samsung Galaxy S9. Now my personal phone is a Samsung Galaxy S9, so I created an emulator for that. Over here on the top bar, there is the Open Android Device Manager. There's also the Open Android SDK Manager. I'm going to go to the SDK Manager first. it's going to launch a new window. This is actually a separate application. And here's where I can install various SDKs for the operating systems of Android. And of course, Android always names their operating system by some type of dessert or candy or sweet. The most recent version is Pie. I would probably recommend you have the most recent versions installed and keep that fresh as new versions come out. In each one of these, as you install, you're going to do the SDK and probably the Google API system image and 64 system image as a minimum. I'm going to close that. And then let's take a look at the Android Device Manager. And here's where you can create your emulators. Same thing, it's going to open up another app. And so there are some emulators here that will be in this list that were installed when you installed Visual Studio. I created one for my Samsung Galaxy 9. And here's how you create a new emulator. Just click the plus new. And in this window, give it a device name. So I'm going to call it my SMCC emulator. I can choose the base device, and if you don't know what to choose, you can always Google and find out for your particular device what that base device is. For the Samsung X9, it was a Pixel XL. And I can choose the operating system that I want. So here I'm using Oreo 8.1. If I wanted to use Pi, the most recent one, I could choose that. In fact, I'll go ahead and make this one Pi. And then here are all the different options for that emulator that you can turn on and off and specify sizes, such as what size SD card do you want to emulate. I'm just going to click Create. And this will take a little bit of a while. So I actually did it really fast. So I can start this emulator if I wanted. I'm going to go ahead and just close this. And then in my list of emulators, I can choose which emulator I want to test my project on. And now in the drop-down list of my emulators, I can choose the emulator I want to use, and you'll see our my SMCC emulator now shows up there. It's using the Android 9.0 API 28 operating system, which is Pi. I'm going to leave it set at my Samsung Galaxy because I already have that emulator up and running, and sometimes it takes quite a while to get the emulators up and running. So my recommendation is, as you install this on your emulator and test it, don't close the emulator, rather just stop the testing from Visual Studio, and that'll save you some time the next time you want to retest on that emulator. So to test on the Samsung Galaxy S9, I'm simply going to click here. It's going to rebuild it for that device and deploy it to the emulator. So here now is my emulator for the Galaxy S9. And there is the display of my interface. Now we have nothing interactive here, so it doesn't do anything. We'll come back and change that in a minute. I just want to test to make sure that it's working to get to my emulator. Now once again, rather than closing the emulator, don't click the X button here. Rather come back to Visual Studio and stop debugging. That leaves the emulator in place and open, and then it's relatively easy to go back and deploy it again to that. On the Mac side, we need to set up a connection to the Mac. And right now mine is paired, but I'm going to show you how to do that. There's this icon here that will pair to a Mac. So I have a MacBook Pro in my Wi-Fi network. I'm going to click this, and I can see that here's my MacBook Pro that is connected. If this was not connected, you could click Add Mac. You might need to know the IP address for your Mac. However, there's some steps that this will walk you through, and I think if you just do a Google search on pairing your Mac to your PC, you'll find those steps. This is basically 3 easy steps, but you do need to set up your Mac to allow remote access, and you can do that through the control panel on the Mac. Again, you'll find some steps there. It's pretty simple to do. Eventually, you'll get a code from the Mac that you have to type into the PC to make that connection to show that you're authorized. Since I'm already connected, I'm just going to close my window here, and I'm going to make the iOS my startup package. And now, same thing up here, I can choose which emulator I want to use. I'm going to stick with the iPhone 8 iOS 11.1, which I was working with earlier, so it's also open on my screen. Now what's going to happen when I go to test this, it's actually going to send the project to the Mac, compile it in Xcode, and send it back, and it will run in the emulator on my computer. I'm going to bring that emulator up. So there's the iPhone 8. We can see the information down here in the bottom left. The simulator has been started to launch the app. It's now deploying it to the simulator. It's already built on the Mac and come back. It does that in the matter of really a few seconds. And here it is running in the iPhone simulator. Once again, I'm going to leave this simulator open. I'm going to go back to Visual Studio. I'm just going to stop debugging. That ends it in the simulator, but keeps the simulator open for future use. So next I want to deploy it and test it on the Microsoft Surface Pro simulator, or I can also test it locally on my Windows machine. But I'm going to make the UWP project the startup project. And here's my options. I can specify the local machine, so it's going to actually install it on this machine that I'm using. I could do a remote machine. I might have a Surface Pro tablet that I can connect, but I'm simply going to use the simulator here. So I'm going to choose simulator, and then I'm going to click it again to actually build it and launch it onto the simulator. So there's the simulator. There's my project coming up on the simulator. It's still installing it, so I just basically get the framework at this point, and then pretty soon we'll see the Welcome to Xamarin Forms at SMCC pop up. And there it is. So all three of my emulators are working for the three projects. Once again, I'm just going to stop debugging in Visual Studio. And the next step then is let's make some changes to our layout, and we'll do some code behind work as part of our workflow. We're going to basically duplicate what we saw in the previous video that we did on the Mac. Alright, so I've already made some changes to my XAML layout. This is what we did in the previous video. We have a stack layout still there, but I set the background to silver. And then inside that stack, I have a label named LBL Campus. I have the background color set to lime, the text color set to black. I gave it a height request of 100, a width request of 300, set the horizontal and vertical options within the stack to center and center expand, and then change the text alignment inside that label to be centered both vertically and horizontally, and set the font family and the attributes. Then we added a button, and this button is named BTN SMCC. Give it a width request of 150, height request of 50. Text is SMCC. Change the background color to blue. Change the text color to white. Give it a clicked event handler of SMCC underscore clicked, and centered it horizontally. I basically just duplicated that button and created a second button underneath of it. So this again is in the stack. So it's placed right under it, and gave it a name of BTN ASU. And I changed the text to ASU and the clicked event to ASU underscore clicked. And then to bring those up a little bit, I added a box view of 50 units that simply raised those buttons up a little bit from the bottom. The box view is really invisible since I didn't change the colors, using whatever the color is of the stack layout. So that's our XAML code to get this new layout, and you can see it reflected over here in the previewer. That's on the Android side. There it is on the iOS side. Very similar. You'll notice the fonts are a little bit different on the iOS side. And then I added some code into the code behind CS file. Remember, we created an SMCC underscore clicked event handler name in our XAML. So here is that event procedure. All we're doing here is changing the text to SMCC. I'm going to change the background color to orange, change the text color to white, and I'm resetting the font size to 24. And that's all happening in the LBL Campus label. The ASU underscore clicked event procedure basically doing the same thing, setting it to Arizona State University, setting the color for the background to gold, the text color to maroon, and the font size to 21, since it's a little bit wider than South Mountain CC. I've made Android my startup, so I'm going to test it on the Samsung Galaxy emulator. And there it is launched on the emulator. I'm going to click the SMCC button. It says South Mountain CC, changes the colors and the font size. If I go ASU, it says Arizona State University, changes the colors and the font size, and I can go back to SMCC. So my buttons here are working and updating this label. I'm going to stop debugging on the Android emulator, come back and set the iOS project as my startup project, and let's test it on the iPhone emulator. And here it is on the iPhone, SMCC, ASU. So they both work. Once again, I'm going to stop debugging. And the last step here is to try it on the Windows Surface Pro emulator. So I make UWP my startup project. I'm going to run it on the simulator. But once again, we have our SMCC button and our ASU button. Now, obviously this is a tablet, so the resolution is much different, and we have a lot more margins based on this landscape tablet size. And once again, I'm going to stop debugging, and I'll probably come back and make more changes as I continue to develop this application. That's a whirlwind tour of creating a Xamarin cross-platform project on the PC, getting it to work with all three platforms, and running it in the simulators.